Okay, so you've heard a little bit about CRUD, create and retrieve and update and delete, or insert and select and update and delete. The challenge, though, is if you're going to write an application against a database, you really don't want to be issuing each of those commands ad hoc. It would be much more convenient for you, and certainly for your readers, if they're going to be running reports or what have you, to be able to wrap that up into an object and then call that object by name. And that's where we get into the idea of stored procedures and then some other items in SQL Server, such as views or functions. So the idea here is that we are wrapping up our CRUD. We are taking our CRUD operations and we're putting a programmatic wrapper around them so that we then invoke it by name. So we still have our insert, select, and update and delete, but let's talk about what you might do with those programmatically. So let's take Graham's table from earlier. We've got our product table with our product ID and our name and our price and our supplier. And let's say that we want to retrieve or select some information from that table. Well, we know now that we can write a select statement. And here we're saying select just the name and price columns from the product table and only give me those rows where the supplier equals 2. And so even before we run this, we can probably look back at that table and say, all right, we're going to get thingybob. So sure enough, we execute that and we get thingybob. Well, that's fine, but I don't expect my users to be able to write that T-SQL every time they want to run a report. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to put a wrapper around that. So let's take that same approach and let's create a view. And a view is a way of storing that select statement by giving it a name, and then we select from the view instead of having to pass in all of the data. And as we'll see in the upcoming demo, there are going to be some limitations on views, and there are some rules that we'll learn. But for now, look at it this way. We're going to say create view VW underscore product price as, and whatever follows as is going to be effectively the source code of this view. So create view VW product price as, and then we use that same statement. Select name price from product where supplier equals 2. But this time when we run this code in SQL, as we'll see in the demo, to use it, we'll then say select name and price from VW product price. We could even say select asterisk, select star from VW product price, since those are the only 2 columns. And we'll get the same response. So why bother? Again, we don't need our users to know all of the names of the columns. We don't necessarily want to give them access to the table itself. We may just want to make it convenient. We don't need them to learn T-SQL. But as we'll see in the demo, there'll be some other things we can do with this. Let's look at this a different way. Remember, CRUD isn't just about retrieve. CRUD is also about making modifications. So let's take 2 other tables here. I've got a little savings table with an account ID and a balance. And I've got a checking table also with an account ID and a balance. And if we look closely, we'll see that account ID 3 has been highlighted in bold in each of these. That's where we're going to do some work. All right. Well, let's start with what the source CRUD statements would be, and then we'll put a wrapper around that programmatically. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write some code that effectively transfers money from checking into savings. I'm going to move $500 out of checking into savings for that account ID 3. So you'll see 2 SQL statements on the left-hand side of my screen. You'll see update savings. All right, so we're going to make a change to the savings table, and then we'll use the set keyword to tell it exactly what we're doing. And we'll see set balance plus equals 500, and that plus equals is a compound operator. That means take the existing value and add 500 to it. You might also write this as set balance equals balance plus 500. Same thing. This is just a little bit more compact. So set the balance plus equals 500 where account ID equals 3. And then we move on and say update checking, set the balance minus equals 500 where account ID equals 3. So that's 2 separate operations, but we want them to run together. So that's where, again, putting a wrapper around this will come into play. So we'll run this. We'll see now that my checking account is down to 500 and my savings is up to 1,500. Great. So how do I wrap that? In this case, I'm going to create a stored procedure. And so I'll use the T-SQL statement create procedure. I'll give it a name, transfer funds. And bear in mind, this is called transfer funds just for the purposes of this slide. I would normally need to supply a 2-part name. We'll see more of that in the demo. So I'll say create procedure transfer funds as, and then what follows is my source code. So in order to invoke this, I will use the T-SQL execute, which we can abbreviate exec, and I'll say exec transfer funds. Now, there's a lot we can do to improve this, to make it more interesting. We'll get to some of that stuff in the demo. But the idea now is, instead of having to write each of those individual statements myself, I can just call it by name. And this is the kind of thing you might map to a button on a form. However, I want to make sure it's clear that just by wrapping this in a T-SQL statement, we're not necessarily putting any kind of error handling in this. We're not doing anything that says if one of these succeeds, the other has to succeed, or vice versa. So just a hint at what's coming, and we'll get much more into this into our SQL development courses. The kind of thing we might add to this is going to be a transaction where we put a wrapper around the operations and say, here's a marker. We're going to begin a transaction. We're going to say what happens now below this must all succeed or it all fails. So we say begin tran. We still have our two update statements. And then if we get this far successfully, we can commit the transaction. It can all be saved to disk. And there are other things we would build into this. For example, we might have some error handling to roll it back. This is not complete code. This is just pseudocode for the purposes of this slide. So as you're seeing, there are ways to create this programmatic layer that you'll use to access your CRUD code. We took a brief look at a view. We took a brief look at a stored procedure. There's lots more you can do with both types of objects, as well as objects like functions. We'll take a look at some of these later in the course.
So what I'd really like to see now is an example of how I build some of these stored procedures or whatever to wrap up my CRUD operations.
All right, let's take a look at a demo.